You know, like, let's take something like E.T., for example. You must have seen E.T. Okay, it's all right, entertaining. But did you ever regard it as the Christian resurrection myth?
No.
Just think about it. E.T. is Christ. He comes from miles away. He wants to go home, heaven. He's persecuted, he's chased, he's misunderstood, everything about Christ. And then finally, you know, he's captured, he's put in a hospital, he's injected, etc., etc., etc. And finally, there's a resurrection. It's a Christ myth. So suddenly, if you think of E.T. as a Christ myth, it becomes much, much richer. You don't have to be a Christian, you can be an atheist, but we all understand the Christian mythology, I'm sure. If you don't believe, I'm sure your grandmother does, so it's a continuity. Well, historically, it's always been the same. Always. Always. If you think of the great periods of cultural ascendancy, let's take Ming Dynasty in Japan, 100 AD. Take the Weimar Republic, before Nazism in the 1930s. Perhaps the best example, Louis XIV, had an extraordinary cultural excitement in Versailles. But there's a pyramid, and all the most important and valuable and long-lasting activities just contained with 100 people at the top of the pyramid. But that pyramid has to be supported by hundreds and thousands of other people in order to look after their lifestyle, etc., provide them with the best coffee from Mexico, etc., etc., etc. So there's nothing new in this. There's absolutely nothing new. But I think we should take comfort that ultimately it is the cusp, the top of the pyramid, that always persists. I think it was the Roman poet Horace who said that all works of art should be 50% entertainment and 50% instruction. If it's all entertainment, then everybody's forgotten it by tomorrow. Hollywood. If it's instruction, if you're not careful, it gets so boring that people walk away, because people don't like to be self-consciously patronized, and people who are instructed, certainly adults who are educated, feel patronized. So you have to find, I suppose, that very clever balance to contain the entertainment with the instruction. But I mean, let me say again, there's nothing new about this in the year 2018. It's always been like this. Yeah, I mean, maybe you think, the particular situation is exacerbated by your particular history. I mean, Mexico has always been the underdog. You've always been exploited, mainly by your North American friends. Still happening. I mean, I just think, it's tragic and it's unfortunate, but I think you just have to be courageous and you have to rely on history. Pushing away, pushing away, pushing away. And eventually, the tables will turn. I make a cinema which I wouldn't say is elitist, but it does deal in a sort of non-egalitarian, a sort of pro-educated cultural background. It's important to know who Caravaggio is. It's important to know, who Paul Klee is. It's important to know, who Pudovkin and Vertov are, because it's all part of this huge cultural influx. And we're all culturally global now, even though Mr. Trump might not like it. It's a fact accomplished, and it's going to increase, and it's going to increase. And it's our heritage, it's everybody's heritage. We're now in the capital I for information age. Huge amounts of material which are there for her and me and you and him to use. It's our heritage. So there should be no excuses about elitism. We can all be extremely elite if we wanted to. And culture's like a soup, isn't it? It's a great thick soup. And it's important to make that soup thicker and thicker and thicker. And I make a cinema which is multi-layered with hundreds of references. But just like Mozart, you know, Mozart was very vulgar. And I'm sure you've seen the Milos Forman film. Pink wig, always farting, etc., etc. But I think, you know, that is part and parcel of the game as well. And the most successful artists are those people who find a way to marry what could be described as high culture with low culture. And I would like to think, I don't know how many of my 80 films you've seen, but there's an incredible amount of mix in that. So I get attacked from both sides. I get attacked from the academic scholastic saying I'm too vulgar, but I get attacked by the so-called, should we say, I'd be careful with my words here, because that's a sign of cultural snobism. I get attacked, you know, for being too elitist. But, you know, the marketplace looks after itself, doesn't it? George Lucas looks after himself. We don't have to worry about him. He's going to go on. Nothing to do with me. And it'll continue. So we don't have to support, you know, Star Wars. Star Wars will happen anyway. All I need is a little space and a little money to insert what I make into this huge distribution system. I could never, ever keep a cinema open. Impossible. So I utilize the system to do what I think I want to do. No, but how can you? How can a filmmaker ever make a film for everybody in this room? It's impossible. You know, he might like penguins on motorcycles. You know, she might like Versace boots in colored pink. You know, she might like swimming like a porpoise. Everybody has a different mindset. It's impossible for me, first of all, to know this, and second, to do something about it. So I think since we now have a global education, which is very imperfect, of course, and you completely balanced differently from New York and Islamabad, there is a way we're all beginning to share a world global culture. And if I use it, the chances are, since we all basically have, as young people, the same education system, I'll be able to communicate. Well, I am very biased because I'm trained as a painter. I'm trained as a painter. And cinema is meant to be about pictures, right? My grandmother used to take me on a Thursday afternoon. She was a pensioner, so she could get in free, and she would drag me into the cinema as well, aged about 5 years. You know, my feet never touched the floor, very small, didn't know what the hell was going on. Give me an ice cream, shut up and watch the wall, which of course I did. I remember one anecdote there. I used to see a lot of Westerns. You know, I went to cinema with my grandmother in the 1950s, and Westerns were very popular. And these people, you know, these cowboys and Indians used to be fighting one another, and I used to think they were always covered in raspberry juice. I couldn't quite understand why they were covered in raspberry juice, but then suddenly one day I realized that raspberry juice was blood. Horror, and I ran screaming out of the cinema. That's to do about sort of knowledge. Sorry, that's an anecdote.
No, it's okay. Thank you.
I think, you know, what we've seen since 1895 is a cinema of illustrated text. Have you ever seen a film that did not start life as a text? They virtually don't exist. It's very difficult to find. You know, even if that text is very humble and there's a few scratchy marks, I used to say on the back of a cigarette packet, but nobody smokes anymore, so I can't use that as a metaphor. But there's a way, you know, even the way we organize it, you know, most films, certainly in the mainstream and even in the underground, are forms of illustrated text. Not so much the novel, but more likely to be the short story. Well, top of my list would be Eisenstein, but I would, bring people like Renoir, for example. I would think about people like Orson Welles. Just going to trot out the normal list, which you're familiar with. Sometimes that list is a little more idiosyncratic. My great sort of almost contemporary hero would be Alain Resnais, who I think is intellectual of the Nouvelle Vague, superb. Of course, I would choose Godard because he's so inventive. I have a personal liking for Antonioni, but I suppose that's gradually becoming more important. Sometimes I think Pasolini's films are very badly made, but I would support him anyway. So you create your own pantheon of people. But that will change, you know. That would change. I used to particularly like David Lynch, for example, but I think now he's become very repetitive and not interesting anymore. Who's the Canadian I used to like, who actually copied my films time after time after time, Cronenberg. But Cronenberg ended up simply illustrating sensational novels, so it became very boring. Okay, I'm beginning to digress a bit here. But I think, you know, if I believe as a painter that cinema should be about images, 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 images. Your Christian godmother probably read Genesis, and in Genesis it said, in the beginning was the Word. That is not true. That is really not true. In the beginning was the image. You know, in Genesis, God sent Adam out to name everything. How could he name everything unless he knew what he had to name? So it's, you know, ridiculous, sort of non sequitur, big oxymoron, big contradiction. So I would argue all the time that we have to make a deeply, deeply imagistic cinema. If you think about it from another position, text, we all talk across all the language barriers all day long. They say, don't they, that man came out of the trees because of gossip. We are, you know, we created language and civilization because of our desire to talk. I don't know whether that's, you know, the ultimate idea. There are lots of other theories, but it's a good theory. So we're very good at it. We're very good at talking, both written and spoken. But very, very few people spend as much time, as much patience, as much energy, as much enthusiasm making images, which is ironic, because I'm convinced the first mark made by civilized hominoids would indeed be a painting. And when civilization goes down the tubes, sooner or later, and I suspect sooner rather than later, and probably in a few weeks' time, the last image will be, and the last mark made by man will be an image. Every alphabet in the world, after all, is imagistic. You know, pictograms, think of Sumeria, think of, you know, Egypt. So I believe, you know, our greatest sense is our eyes. I'm absolutely convinced about that. You might put forward music. Music certainly has a great history, but I think, you know, we have to escape the tiger. I don't think music's involved in that. I think it's our eyes primarily who create that particular background. So I would push all the time for a cinema of images. May I give you a quotation? Rembrandt said, just because you've got eyes doesn't mean you can see. You and I didn't fall out of the womb talking. Our mothers had to teach us. Primarily, it's always our mothers. You have to blame your mother for so many things. But first of all, she's the first person who tried to teach us, first of all, how to speak. Writing came much later when you're 5 years old. So, you know, there's no way that these things come naturally, and all art is elitist. I'm sorry. You know, even we might have very good socialist principles about egalitarianism, art is very elite. And the more elite it is, going back to our first discussion, I think the more profound it is, the deeper it is, the richer it is. And there's a lot of sense in the world now about the coming barbarism, isn't there? The barbarians are coming. Think of Mr. Trump, you know, barbarians through and through and through. Did you ever see a film I made called The Cook, the Thief's Wife and Her Lover? The Coming of the Barbarians. That film appeared in Russia and was very, very successful because people realized this was a possible metaphor of what happened when capitalism came to the Soviet Union. Vulgar oligarchs with no sense of history, no sense of ethics, no sense of morals. And I think for that reason, the Russians, you know, thought the film was very interesting for them, and it was extremely popular. All right, you can see I'm trying to drag all these red threads together. So I'm looking all the time for a cinema made by painters. I'm not going to get it. I'm not going to get it because most of us, I imagine you, I would describe you, without wishing to insult you in any way, as being visually illiterate. Most painting, up till the Impressionists, was illustrated text. Most of it was either illustrating the Bible or ancient Roman or Greek history. Just run your mind through all those hundreds of paintings in the Louvre, the National Gallery, everywhere. They're very largely illustrated stories. And it was only with Monet, you know, painting in London, escaping the Franco-Prussian War in 1871, that suddenly he threw away all this business about archival interest, you know, telling stories. You don't have to tell stories.
He was telling his own.
That's right. So the paint itself became the subject matter. No, it's the medium is the message. The actual medium becomes the message, becomes the content. People find it very difficult to understand that, but I'm sure, you know, certainly your mother and you and me would all perfectly understand that notion. So I would try, you know, to push the idea of the image to the image. But it's difficult, isn't it? Because most producers are visually illiterate. They want a text. And if that text already works in the marketplace, like Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter, they're overjoyed. You know, I think, you know, Scorsese, let's suppose that Scorsese is the most critically admired of contemporary filmmakers, but he still makes the same films as Griffiths. Stories, narratives, beginnings, middles and ends. All that language is the same. But you know, if we're talking about 1895 and 2018, look what's happened in that gap in literature. H.G. Wells to Borges. Think what's happened in music, Strauss to, you name it, Stockhausen. Think about what happened in, you know, painting. You know, we're going from Van Gogh to Andy Warhol. Huge changes in attitude. But cinema has not happened. It hasn't happened like that. You know, okay, we're now an electronic medium and we used to be a mechanical medium, but the language and the grammar and the syntax is still basically the same. Also, yes. But I think that the, is it Sotheby's or Christie's? I can't remember which. I think Christie's are in the game as well. Yes, you could not have pulled that off. That would not have worked. But it's like, you know, Marcel Duchamp, it's like the Dadaists. They're doing that to art history, the industry, because the art industry, you know, is so powerful, but it doesn't represent merit. It's a capitalist, material, property situation. Well, I would always argue that question, what else is there to talk about? You know, I don't know very much about you. I know presumably you're a Mexican. Your prime language is Spanish. But there are two things I know about you and him and everybody in this room. Two people fucked to make you, and I'm very sorry, but you're going to die. Everything else is amorphous, changeable, related to some notion of free will, however limited that free will. It's related to your nationality, your economic background, the fact that your mother's fascinated by painting. But, you know, those characteristics probably don't relate to anybody else in the room. But the two major characteristics are eros and thanatos. That sounds rather a pompous Greek way of talking about it, and rather academic, but it really means simply sex and death. And both those moments are unknowable. You know, Salvador Dali thought he was around when his parents fucked, but that's Salvador Dali. But also the moment of death is unknowable, but you can't examine it because you're dead. So these two beginning ends, you know, the bookends of your life, I'm absolutely sure, are responsible for all culture, all cinema, all religion. Christianity is a supreme example of how this functions. And I think, you know, as I said again last night, you know, Balzac suggested money was important, but money hasn't been around that long, and an awful lot of stupid people have it, so how can it be important? And then if you read Shakespeare, you might think that power. But isn't power also a way to manipulate sex and death? To live as long as you possible, get as much power. You know, all the big ideas now about artificial intelligence and longevity, they're all pushing very hard now for us to live forever, which is never going to work. And, you know, to be able to be completely liberal about our notions about sexual activity. And I think maybe, you know, death's far more important now than sex. You know, we have crossed so many sexual frontiers in the last generation. You know, our freedoms about homosexuality, our notions even about abortion, and all these things ultimately will be won, because the right is always wrong, right? The right is always wrong. So, you know, the so-called left, with all its imperfections, is obviously going to win out. It's inevitable.